All right, Isaiah 25. Now, I did start today's stream late, but I'm already taking too long, so I'm going to try to pick up the pace here. I just love these chapters. There's so much here that you just can dive into for much longer than what we have today. That's why, though, we've got the notes and our discussion group to unpack these further. O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful things, plans from old, faithful and sure. Wow, plans from old. I think Isaiah is really recognizing this is not just about my generation. This is about Abraham's generation and the promises made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and his generation and the covenants on Mount Sinai and David and his generation and the covenants to David. Oh my goodness. I mean, he's seeing the whole scope, plans that are from old, faithful and sure, that are all going to culminate and come into fulfillment all together in the Messianic age. It is such a cool, there's just a lot in these chapters. I'm sorry, I got to keep going. But Isaiah includes a song of celebration, celebrating the defeat of Israel's enemies and depicting a great feast in Jerusalem and the ultimate removal of death that results from the progressive restoration of the Messianic age. For you have made, now verse 2, you have made the city a heap, the fortified city a ruin. Now that city we're going to have to come back to again in a later chapter. But that city he's really talking about is the epicenter of that wicked Babylon system, that representative Babylon system of centralized authority that is very prosperous, but it's very oppressive. And so for you have made the city a heap, the fortified city a ruin. The foreigner's place is a city no more. It will never be rebuilt. It's talking about that desolation of Babylon that I think, do we have a quote from that from... No, we're going to move on. We'll come back to it. We're going to come back to that. Therefore, strong peoples will glorify you. Cities of ruthless nations will fear you. Those even who in that day were being ruthless nations will come to fear the Lord. Gentile nations experience a correction in their relationship to God in the Messianic age. Nations who formerly sought independence and arrogant, overconfident strength will credit God's strength. Nations who Israel once feared will fear Israel and their Messiah. For you have been a stronghold to the poor, a stronghold to the needy in his distress, which occurred primarily during the rebellion as the Babylon system oppressed many of the poor, and a shelter from the sword and a shade from the heat. Now that's literal. Because remember in Isaiah chapter 4, Isaiah pointed out that the pillar of cloud and fire returns at the beginning of the Messianic age to provide a literal shelter. So that's very, very real when we're looking at that. That's not just a figurative shelter. Yeah, sure, it is a figurative shelter, but it's more than that. It's also a literal shelter that will demonstrate that figurative shelter that is the Lord's presence. For the breath of the ruthless is like a storm against the wall, like heat in a dry place. What an interesting thing. The testimony of the leadership of Jesus coming out of the tribulation is his attractive care or his attentive care for the poor and needy. And Isaiah continues to imply that the poor and righteous receive some sovereign protection from the unrelenting ruthlessness of the Antichrist. This is the breath of the ruthless, is both the wicked kings who rule the Babylon system, but it's also the ruthless one who is the Antichrist, whose ruthlessness is like a storm against a wall, like just unrelenting, just pressure that, again, thankfully, God has been a stronghold. And what's awesome is that as we're looking at this example, he's saying God has been a stronghold for the poor. Even in the midst of that pressure, this is a promise of preservation in the midst of that pressure, that when we get to the Messianic age, people will sing of the ways that God came through and delivered the oppressed during the tribulation and during Babylon. And ultimately, of course, in the final defeat of Israel's enemies and the beginning of the Messianic age, but all throughout, I think all of that is included here because that's what he's talking about. The Antichrist has been ruthless. Babylon has been ruthless. But you subdue the noise of the foreigners as heat by the shade of a cloud, like that, who are like heat, but you're like the shade of a cloud. To the song of the ruthless is put down. Again, a reference to music. If you're a musician, you need to be making a note of all these references that Isaiah is making to music. Amos does as well. Where else? Well, we'll look into more. But that would be a whole nother topical study that I highly recommend for worship leaders and musicians and singers. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for peoples a feast. Oh, I love it. Isaiah prophesies this grand feast of rich food hosted for all the tribulation survivors who are and resurrected saints who are in Jerusalem during the Messianic age. Isaiah does not provide much about the logistics of this massive feast, though later prophets like Ezekiel really will elaborate on how that's actually going to work. Literally, all the peoples of the earth literally will come to a feast. And it will probably take years, but it's very, very real. And Ezekiel gets into detail about the logistics of where they enter, where they depart, where they eat, where the food is cooked, who cooks the food. This is very, very literal. And I'm jumping ahead, but Isaiah sees it right here. So when we get to Ezekiel, we can remember this is what was said by the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 25. It's a beautiful, beautiful promise. But yet more. And he, the Lord, will swallow up on his mountain the covering that has been cast over all the people, the veil that has been spread over all the nations. He will swallow up death forever. Not just Satan, not just the Antichrist, every consequence of sin, and even the highest one of all, and that is the consequence of death. The Lord will wipe away all the tears from all the faces, and the reproach of his people will be taken away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. My goodness. Now, again, Isaiah is stating the primary objective of the Messianic age will be to reverse every consequence of sin from the earth progressively. This happens over time because people actually do die during the Messianic reign. But toward the end, when the final judgment happens, all of that is done away. That final judgment means it is the swallowing up of death where it's no more. There's even no more resurrection. Like death is done. It's over with. Sin's consequences are not necessarily instantly resolved, but are resolved as a result of a gradual process during the Messianic age. The Apostle Paul makes this clear in 1 Corinthians 15. If you'd like a New Testament reference, Paul describes the resurrection and the reigning of the Messiah after that first resurrection of the righteous. And he says, for he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last of them is to be destroyed is death itself. And other prophets will get into that final judgment at the end of the Messianic reign and the defeat of death at that time, which we'll have to get into in a later passage because Isaiah doesn't get into that much detail here. But that's what he's talking about. It's so cool to see. And soon, in a few weeks, we'll get into those. Isaiah does not yet reveal the identity of the singers in this verse, but as chapter 26 will reveal, these are resurrected saints who endured the tribulation. Here they are. It will be said on that day, here they're singing, behold, this is our God. We have waited for him that he might save us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. Let us be glad and rejoice at his salvation. Isaiah includes a message to those who wait on the Lord as they endure the tribulation. Notice how the language of these verses shifts, starting in verse 10, from what God has done to now what God will do. And so we're kind of looking into the past at Isaiah's point. Like Isaiah is describing the Messianic age, but now he's going back to give encouragement to those who are going through the rebellion and tribulation. This will be a crucial message of hope for the people of God to declare during the unprecedented pressure of the tribulation. For the hand of the Lord will rest on his mountain, and Moab, which is representative of adversarial nations, will be trampled down in his place. As straw is trampled down in a dunghill. Moab is like an example of one of those wicked nations from Psalm 2. And he will spread out his, even though he, being Moab, or those adversarial nations will spread out their hands in the midst of the nations like a swimmer. They're trying to build momentum to spread their hands out to swim, to build momentum to destroy Israel. Well, the Lord will lay low his pompous pride together with the skill of his hands. And the high fortification of his walls will be brought down and laid low and cast to the ground, even to the dust. And there you go, the end of chapter 25. So again, interesting. Isaiah is giving this message to those who are having to persevere and endure in the midst of the tribulation and the rebellion, which I think we had up here as well. because God's going to be a stronghold to the poor and to the needy, and a shelter from the storm in those days. And that's part of the promise here. All right, that does it for chapter 25. Let's move on.